Hi, and welcome to This is Barry. Shutter Island is a brilliant film directed by Martin Scorsese and is based on a novel by the same name. This video is full of spoilers, so come back after watching the movie. Andrew Laeddis loved his wife Dolores, and they had 3 kids. Dolores was insane, manic-depressive, and suicidal. Dolores' condition worsened, and one day she purposely set fire to their apartment, and they were forced to move to their lake house. And finally, on a day when Andrew was out for work, Dolores drowned her 3 children. Andrew was horrified at the sight of his 3 dead children. He blamed himself for their death and not getting Dolores medical help in time. Andrew lost his mind and killed Dolores. Andrew goes utterly insane, and his mind is unable to face what he's done. He is admitted to Ward C at the psychiatric facility in Ashcliff at Shutter Island. Ward C is where they keep the most dangerous patients. Dr. John Cawley treats Andrew, and Dr. Lester Sheehan is Andrew's primary psychiatrist. They have been treating him for over 2 years. Because of Andrew's violence, the board wants to lobotomize him. The trauma was so intense that Andrew Laeddis created an alternate reality for himself where he is Edward Daniels. Edward Daniels is an anagram of Andrew Laeddis. In his fantasy, Edward is a U.S. Marshal investigating a case on Shutter Island. His wife Dolores was not insane and died in an apartment fire. His mind has created an imaginary bad guy named Andrew Laeddis, responsible for this fire. According to Edward, this Andrew was taken to Shutter Island, and there was no word of him after. Edward has spun a conspiracy theory around the happenings on Shutter Island and aims to expose it. The Shutter Island ending sees Dr. Cawley explain that over the course of the treatment, there was once a moment when Andrew came back to his senses, but he regressed after that. Dr. Cawley swears before the board that he will execute a cutting-edge role play where he will let Andrew play out his fantasy as Edward and use that to bring him back. The board agrees, and that is the role play that we see through the film. Noyce is also a patient in Ward C, nothing more. 2 weeks before they begin the role play, Andrew beats Noyce to a pulp for calling him Andrew. Leo's character has developed an intense hatred for himself. Being associated with Andrew enrages him. Edward has created a backstory for Noyce. A nice college kid, socialist, he gets offered some money to do a psych study. After that, he starts seeing dragons everywhere. He almost beats his professor to death, ends up in Ashcliff, Ward C. They release him after 1 year. After 2 weeks on the mainland, he walks into a bar and stabs 3 men to death. His lawyer pleads insanity, but Noyce, he stands up in the courtroom and he begs the judge for the electric chair. Anywhere but a mental hospital. Based on this imaginary story, Edward concludes that they are experimenting on people on Shutter Island. Rachel Solando is the anagram of Dolores Chanel. In reality, there is no Rachel Solando. It's a person Andrew's mind has created. The Rachel we see is only a role played by one of the staff. In the fantasy, Rachel Solando is a missing patient at Ashcliff. She is a war widow who has killed all 3 of her children. Edward believes he has gotten a call to go investigate her disappearance. You will notice that water and fire play 2 crucial elements in Shutter Island. Water, because Andrew's kids drowned in a lake. Throughout the film, you will observe that water makes Leo's character very uncomfortable. His mind blocks out water as much as it can. Fire, because his apartment was burnt down. His mind doesn't block out the fire because he doesn't blame himself for the fire in the apartment. He blames a fictional character called Andrew for it. In reality, Chuck is Dr. Lester Sheehan, Andrew's primary psychiatrist. He is part of the role play. In the fantasy, Chuck is Edward's partner assigned to the case. Edward believes that he has never met Chuck before. Edward and Chuck land up on Shutter Island. The captain tells them that a storm is coming. At the island, they are both escorted by the guards, who seem very much on edge, rightfully so. Many of these guards have been beaten up by Andrew. They are also part of the role play. Edward and Chuck are told that Ward C is for the most dangerous patients and is off limits. The guard takes away their firearms. Their firearms are merely toys. Chuck has no prior experience with guns, hence you see him struggle trying to pull it out of his holster. Edward and Chuck meet with Dr. Cawley, who is leading the role play. Cawley gives made-up information about Rachel, the missing patient. Edward has a headache and asks for an aspirin. Cawley explains that Rachel still believes that her children are alive, and this place is her home in the Berkshires. She believes they're all delivery men, milkmen, and postal workers. Cawley mentions that Rachel disappeared from her locked room. On visiting her room, Edward finds a note saying, "Law of 4, who is 67?" The note is kept there as part of the role play. Edward asks for access to personnel files. Cawley purposely dodges this to fuel the conspiracy in Edward's mind. Edward demands to speak with all the staff. They are assembled after dinner. At the meeting, which is entirely part of the role play, Edward learns that a staff named Glenn went on an unscheduled bathroom break, which could have been when Rachel escaped. They also mention that Rachel was in a group therapy session before going to her room with one Dr. Sheehan. Remember, Edward doesn't associate Chuck with Dr. Sheehan. Cawley says it is not possible to meet Sheehan as he is on holiday. Here's the thing about the storm. There isn't one. It's just raining. The violent storm is only in Edward's mind, created because of his discomfort with water. As part of the role play, the staff places props to amplify the effects of this storm. The storm is used as an excuse to claim they are unable to reach Sheehan on the phone. Cawley invites Edward and Chuck over for drinks at his place, where they meet Dr. Jeremiah. He is a senior doctor who is also part of the role play. He purposely gives off evil Nazi vibes. He brings up Edward's defense mechanisms to trigger a lack of trust, amplifying Edward's conspiracy theory. Edward demands the files of the staff and is denied them yet again. He gets irritated and states that the investigation is done and they will leave by ferry in the morning. Edward feels that Rachel had help getting out of her cell, and he believes they will get more information on the case the following day. At night, Edward has a dream where Dolores appears and says that both Rachel and Andrew are still on Shutter Island. Dolores then burns to ashes. The following day, Edward asks to interview the patients in Rachel's group therapy. Given the storm has taken out any possibility of a ferry ride, they'd rather continue the investigation. The interviews are all part of the role play. You can see that Edward can't stand that folks with mental illness have caused harm to innocent people. He hates them for being criminals regardless of the state of their minds. This is the reason he can't face his own crime. They eventually speak with a Mrs. Kearns, a lady who axed her husband to death. When asked about Dr. Sheehan, she glances at Chuck and asks for water. When Chuck is away, she quickly scribbles "run" on Edward's note because she thinks the doctors are acting strangely. Chuck gets her water. You notice that there is no glass in her hands. This is Leo's character suppressing water. This gives us a glimpse of how much he can't stand his reality. Edward then asks her about Andrew. The lady says she's never heard of him with a very suspicious tone, as if she were hiding something. While this is part of the role play, she understands she is in front of the most dangerous patient, and her nervousness is real. Edward buys the act and thinks they were all coached, that they all said things that they were instructed to say. Chuck purposely asks Edward who Andrew is and why he was asking about him. Edward then tells Chuck that he took on this Shutter Island case specifically because he is after Andrew, the maintenance guy who set fire to his apartment. Edward has even created a face for Andrew. Ugly-looking son of a gun, huge scar from his right temple down to his left lip. Edward says he saw news about him being sent to prison and then transferred here. While Chuck and Edward are out, the storm hits harder in Edward's mind, and they take shelter. Edward further explains that he's not there to kill Andrew, but to blow Ashcliffe's cover and expose their evil Nazi experiments. Chuck fuels the conspiracy by saying that Edward didn't get lucky to land this case, but was chosen to come to the island to be disposed of. Chuck says now he, too, is trapped with Edward. The deputy warden finds them, and they are taken back to their quarters. They are given staff clothes as their own are wet, and are also given a fresh pack of cigarettes. This is all on purpose. They are taken to a meeting to discuss what to do if the storm becomes too intense, creating the illusion of a hurricane in Edward's head. They also talk about the fact that there are 24 patients in Ward C and 42 in Wards A and B. Edward puts this together to state that Rachel's note talked about 67. 24 plus 42 is 66. Edward says Rachel was talking about a 67th patient on Shutter Island. Right after this, Dr. Cawley announces to Edward that Rachel has been found. They meet Rachel, whose role is being played by one of the staff. She convincingly plays a crazy lady who's killed her children. She refers to Edward as Jim, her dead husband, which really shakes him. Cawley says that they found her by the lighthouse. Edward gets a migraine and Cawley gives him pills to relieve the pain. Let's talk about Edward's headaches. As revealed in the end, Leo's character has been off his regular medication on purpose because of the role play. This is causing withdrawal symptoms. Edward is taken down to the basement and put on a bed. He goes to sleep and has another nightmare. He sees a little girl saying, "You should have saved us all." That little girl was the youngest of his children. Then he sees the fictional man with a scar that he calls Andrew. Rachel appears asking for help with the dead children and asks him to find Andrew. Cawley fakes a generator failure, and many inmates run loose. Edward and Chuck decide to sneak into Ward C. One of the patients talks to Edward. Noyce is a Ward C-level crazy person. Over the past 2 years, as an inmate, Leo's character has filled his head with conspiracy theories about what goes on inside the lighthouse. Noyce merely repeats all of that in this scene. While Noyce initially refers to Leonardo's character as Laeddis, he later states that Laeddis is not in the ward and that he was transferred out of there. Noyce is not part of the role play. We merely witness two mentally unstable people having a conversation. Chuck meets Edward, and they get out. Chuck says that he found an intake form in Andrew's name, but Edward avoids looking at it because a part of his brain knows it is his own intake form. After his conversation with Noyce, Edward believes that Chuck is part of the conspiracy too. He ditches Chuck and tries to make it to the lighthouse, but he can't, as the tide is too high. He gets back and realizes that Chuck is gone. His cigarette is left at the edge of the cliff, though. Edward looks down, thinks he sees Chuck's body in the water below, and begins climbing down. While the cliff is shown to be really tall and steep, it is simply Edward's perception. Just like the rain has become a hurricane, the short rocks have become a cliff in Edward's head. Think about it. Cawley wouldn't risk his patient dying. On descending, Edward sees a cave lit from within. He enters the cave to see a woman who claims to be the real Rachel Solando, a doctor at the facility. This lady is Edward's hallucination. She says she started asking about the large shipments of opium-based hallucinogens and surgeries. Then she asks about Edward's headaches and funny dreams and checks if he has taken any pills, even aspirin. She suggests his food, coffee, and even the cigarettes have been drugged. She then talks about brain surgeries in the lighthouse and how everyone on the island knows about them. The night ends. This entire scene is Edward's paranoia playing out. We're effectively watching Leo's character talking to himself. The following day, Dr. Rachel asks Edward to leave as she doesn't want to be found. The warden runs into Edward and takes him back. The warden purposely talks about violence with pride feeding Edward's paranoia. Edward meets Cawley and says, "I think we've gotten all we came here for." Cawley asks, "We?" He says, "You don't have a partner, Marshall. You came here alone." Edward now fully believes that Cawley has set traps to declare him crazy. As Edward tries to get to the ferry, he runs into Dr. Jeremiah, who's carrying an injection. The injection is merely a placebo to give Edward the feeling that he's going to be tranquilized. Edward uses the injection on Dr. Jeremiah and makes a run for it. Edward creates a distraction by blowing up Cawley's car and heads to the lighthouse to save Chuck, who he believes is being experimented on. Despite his mind, in the form of Dolores, telling him to head to the ferry, he decides to save his partner. The ending of Shutter Island reveals that Edward Daniels is indeed Andrew Laeddis, the 67th patient at Shutter Island who has been under treatment there for 2 years. Dr. Cawley has fueled the conspiracy theory to a point where Edward expected to see humans being experimented upon in the lighthouse. But the truth is, there is nothing in the lighthouse. No experiments, no surgeries, no nothing. "Why are you all wet, baby?" Collie asks as he's calmly waiting for Edward. This is the question that Andrew had asked his wife, Dolores, when she was sitting by the lake after drowning their children. Collie says that Dr. Rachel Solando isn't real and that the shaky hands are because of withdrawal from not having the medication that Leo's character has been on for 2 years at Ashcliff. He reads out the intake form that Edward had avoided earlier. The patient is highly intelligent, highly delusional, decorated Army veteran, known proclivity for violence, shows no remorse for his crime because he denies the crime ever took place. Highly developed and fantastical narratives which preclude facing the truth of his actions. Collie explains that Dolores Chanel and Rachel Solando are anagrams, and so are Edward Daniels and Andrew Laeddis. Dr. Collie tells Andrew they will lobotomize him if he doesn't snap out of it. Andrew almost killed Noyce 2 weeks ago, and the board wants to put an end to this. Chuck enters wearing a suit and reveals that he is Dr. Sheehan. Collie wants Andrew to see how untrue and impossible the conspiracy theory is. Edward picks up his revolver and shoots at Collie. The gun is not real. They tell him about what Dolores had done. Edward recollects the death of his children and wife and faints. Andrew wakes up and is back to sanity. He states how everything about Edward and Rachel was made up. Andrew remembers not taking any action about his wife's mental condition. Collie says they once broke through to Andrew 9 months ago, but he regressed. So they wait until the following day to see if Andrew will stay sane or regress again. In the closing scene, Dr. Sheehan approaches Andrew and talks to him as Chuck again, a final test to see if the role play worked. Andrew says, "We gotta get off this rock, Chuck. Whatever the hell's going on here, it's bad." Dr. Sheehan looks and gives a disapproving nod to Dr. Collie, indicating that Andrew has regressed again. The staff approach to take away Andrew for the lobotomy. Just then, Andrew tells Dr. Sheehan, "You know, this place makes me wonder, which would be worse, to live as a monster or to die as a good man?" Here's what this means. Andrew has not regressed. He's only acting like he has. He has snapped out of his insanity, but now his guilt is not letting him live on. If he discloses that he has not regressed, Andrew will live on as the monster responsible for his family's death. Instead, he decides to revert to Edward Daniels, the good man. Edward is taken away for lobotomization, bringing us to the end of the film and this video. What did you think about Shutter Island? Do leave your thoughts and theories on the movie in the comments section, and for more film explanations, check out thisisbarry.com.